cars were stationed 24/7 at either end, one to the east and one to the west. This all went on for 3 days while some unknown official body did what needed to be done. Then overnight, the black barbed wire fence was gone, replaced with the normal chain link variety. A few middle school kids dared Kevin Witter to apply a pair of wire cutters and sneak in. My little half-brother knew Kevin. The kid claimed to have seen unmarked vans and a bevy of sunglasses-wearing government agents with automatic weapons surrounding a team of scientists in hazmat suits, dragging the carcass of a monster out of the water. The monster had 10 legs, the skin of an alligator, and the body of a squid, or the body of a shark, or matted fur or feathers or teeth. It changed per telling, and it was all bullshit. I'm guessing Kevin Witter either chickened out before doing the deed or else was picked up by the cops as soon as he approached the fence. At the end of 3 days, some early risers in Juniper Valley reported seeing 3 unmarked cars heading east on Skylark Road, towards the highway and the Air Force Base and the Palmdale Airport. Whatever government agency was operating behind the blockade, searching the lake, they were gone without a trace by the time the sun came up. And whatever they found, they weren't telling. The cops were clueless. All they told us townsfolk was that due to a bacterial infestation, we were not to swim in the lake until farther notice. I will never swim in that lake again, and I hope to God they killed them all. I stayed in Juniper Valley during the summer with my father. He and my stepmother loved it there. Loved the isolation and the small town lifestyle. Though I would hesitate to even call Juniper Valley a town, it's an unincorporated cluster of ranch-style homes planted like a pimple among the Sierra Pelona Mountains. In the 90s, the population of Juniper Valley and the surrounding hills was 800 and change. There was one general store in town, one gas station, one church, and one dirty little inn with a bar restaurant. Anything else one would need could be found in Palmdale, a 45-minute drive east, through miles of gridded power lines and golden flatland, dotted with silos and scrap metal. The town resembles a bowl with Lake Colette at the basin, and streets and houses arranged around the edges, along the slopes of the surrounding hills. Calling Lake Colette a lake is also stretching things a little bit. It's a sag pond right on the San Andreas Fault, which cuts straight through Juniper Valley. During droughts, Lake Colette would drain to a glorified puddle, a mossy marsh of waist-high weeds. There were quite a few rainy years during my childhood. Lake Colette would remain a proper body of water then, even in the midst of a hot, dry summer. I'd look out my bedroom window at the lake, below the dim circles of light cast by the 2 street lamps on Skylark Road, pitch black like a tar pit. On moonless nights it seemed bottomless, and I felt as though it could be a kilometers deep well, a black hole. I grew up. My months in Juniper Valley became skull-crushingly boring. My dad and stepmother worked, my half-siblings attended a summer program at their school, and my friends were 70 miles away. The nearest library was almost as far, and the rabbit-eared TV picked up 3 channels: local access from Palmdale, the Bible channel, and assorted infomercials. It was my step-grandmother who told me about the Will Fell Animal Sanctuary. She went to church with a lady who ran the place, a retired park ranger named Kathy. The shelter was a nonprofit funded solely by donations with an all-volunteer staff. Kathy owned an acre of hillside land off Skylark Road, just west of town, a 15-minute walk from my father's house. I was 13 the first summer I volunteered at Will Fell, and I went back every summer after. They loved me there. By they, I mean the only 2 staff members. Kathy, an earthly woman in her 60s who functioned as CEO, manager, accountant, and primary caretaker of the animals, and Jacques, a 27-year-old autistic man who cleaned cages and walked dogs as part of a government-subsidized program. And I fell in love with the animals. There were about 60 of them, homeless dogs and unwanted cats. There were 2 huge kennels in Kathy's large backyard built by her sons, one for dogs and one for cats. Farther back, rabbit hutches, and at the far end, against the sturdy fence, a tiny stable that housed an elderly racehorse and a fat little donkey. When Pounds and Palmdale and Lancaster received animals they had no room for, they'd give them to Kathy. She'd drive her rickety old windowless van east to the highway, then come back hours later with new furry charges. Sometimes she'd even function as a poor man's dog catcher. Agencies would direct her towards residences from Juniper Valley to Acton, asking her to remove starving, nearly hairless dogs from gardens and pull emaciated cats out from under cars. These were the highway strays, abandoned on the 14 by individuals who no longer wished to be pet owners. That first summer, I met Jane. Jane was a friend of Kathy's, a retired Navy nurse who worked as an at-home caregiver and took in homeless cats. She visited Wolfville at least once a week, sometimes bringing large bags of cat food. Jane was a rough lady, tanned, sinewy, wrinkly beyond her years, only ever seen wearing stained wife beaters and baggy fatigues. She never married, had no family I knew of, and seemed to prefer the company of cats to humans. Kathy considered her an asset. She'd take in 20 cats at a time, accepting responsibility when we had no more room. She owned a half-acre a few miles southwest of town, off a shabby two-lane road called Oak Tree Lane. Oak Tree Lane snakes between gray-green hills before dead-ending deep in the Angeles National Forest. Rusting mailboxes stick out of the ground like flags at the head of dirt roads, leading to remote ranches and groves and campgrounds. Jane's cottage was at the end of one of these dirt roads, in a little clearing carpeted with knee-high weeds and prickly shrubs, surrounded on three sides by gently sloping hills. She'd take me there sometimes. There were always cats everywhere. Cats inside and out, cats on the sofa, cats sitting atop Jane's washer, cats sunning themselves, stalking field mice and butterflies. I'd spend hours at Jane's house with her cats, helping her clean up and clean litter boxes, cuddling kittens from the occasional litter. Jane liked me. Since she obviously felt little need for human companionship, I took this as the highest of compliments. Every summer on the first day I'd see her, Jane would break out into the biggest, brightest smile that Kathy swore she reserved only for me. "You're like me, Matthew," Jane would say, as I stared out the window of her 1979 El Camino. "You can cut through anyone's bullshit and see their soul. That's why you love animals so much. Your standards for souls are higher than most." The earthquake hit the winter of my junior year. I remember waking in the middle of the night, roused by the thud of my precariously placed math book falling off my desk. The mild shaking lasted about 3.5 seconds, then I realized I'd experienced an earthquake. My dad, his family, and Juniper Valley were hit a bit harder. Positioned on the San Andreas Fault and close to the remote epicenter, structural damage was rather extensive. The mess had been cleared up by summer, but I noticed broken sandbag barricades and new violent cracks along Skylark Road. Lake Colette looked more robust than I'd ever seen it, but was surrounded by a chain-link fence. The water had taken on a greenish tinge and hosted islands of thick yellowish scum. For now, it was closed to the public. Kathy's windowless van still hadn't broken down, but she was tired of driving it all over the valley, so she handed me the keys. I enjoyed it at first, rambling through Golden Plains until I saw the boxy developments of Palmdale, rescuing filthy, unloved creatures from the clutches of abusive owners or uncaring bureaucracy. Jane had all but disappeared. Her last nursing charge had passed away, and she was rarely seen in town. Only at the general store, Kathy told me, and very rarely. I think Kathy and I were the only people in Juniper Valley who noticed her absence. I missed Jane. I missed the way her face lit up when she saw me, and the warm summer afternoon spent in her backyard. I called her landline once. It had been disconnected. Soon, the cats started appearing. My third day back, I was sitting in Kathy's office when I received a phone call from a talkative old lady in town. There was a cat in her backyard. It had been sitting in a lower branch of her oak tree for hours. "I think it's someone's pet," she said. "It's too chubby to be a stray." This, in and of itself, was not an extraordinary event. Everyone in town knew Kathy ran a shelter and would infrequently call her in lieu of animal control when an unknown animal became a bother. Sometimes said animal would be a neighbor's lost pet. Other times a runaway that had wandered from Palmdale. Kathy always made an effort to find the owner. Rarely a feral, abandoned highway stray would make it to Juniper Valley. These poor creatures were always half-dead things with matted fur and exposed, dotted skin. They usually had to be euthanized, or died before the local vet got the chance. At first, I assumed the calm, well-groomed gray and white shorthair I found in the old lady's oak tree was the former, a townie's escaped house cat. I tried to coax the thing down with a can of tuna. No dice. It wasn't remotely interested in the food. It just stared. Black, depthless eyes locked on something that wasn't me. I stood, tuna can in outstretched hand, looking like an idiot, for 5 frustrating minutes before giving up and going to the van to grab Kathy's net. When I got back, the cat was gone. I never saw it again. It bothered me all night. It was like the cat had been messing with me. And it happened again and again. Homeowner after homeowner of Juniper Valley calling Wilfell and asking us to remove a cat from their property. Always cats. Always different cats. I don't think I ever saw the same one twice. The homeowner always insisted he or she had never seen the animal before, and they never had collars. They always appeared well fed, if not overfed. Their fur, though not show quality, was thick and intact. It became troubling. Juniper Valley had a population of 842. It was located 45 minutes from the nearest town and surrounded on 3 sides by hills and forest. Everyone knew everyone else's pets, and the sudden appearance of so many unaccounted for cats was mysterious, to say the least. And these cats were not like any cats I'd ever seen before. They liked fresh water. I'd find them sitting in fountains and kiddie pools. They didn't seem to like the sun. They'd come out at night or else be found in some shaded, dark, enclosed space. They were silent, never hissing or meowing. They were really, really good at getting in and out of places. I found one curled up in the back of a lady's car. Though she admitted she'd left the door unlocked, the physical act of opening and closing the door should have been impossible for a creature with only paws at its disposal. They were smart. Supernaturally smart. At times, I fell under the disturbing impression the cat was taunting me. I'd be setting up some trap or extending the net. The cat would sit there, calm and cool, watching intently. There'd be a minute in which I'd have some semblance of hope I'd finally catch the thing this time, and then the cat would dart out of my grasp, or vanish the moment I turned my back. The weirdest part was, once or twice, the cat stopped before running off and looked at me. I could swear it was laughing. And they all shared the same icy, emotionless black eyes. I wished they didn't remind me so much of the empty eyes staring from the euthanized corpses I saw at Wilfell. Finally, I caught one. It was early July. I was quite pleased with my cunning. I bought one of those huge plastic storage tubs from the general store, filled it with water, stuck it in the back of the van, and waited for my feline quarry. A large pug-faced tabby this time. After an hour of hiding in the cab, the cat climbed down from the roof where I'd found it and into the waiting reservoir. I raced to the back, slammed the van doors, donned leather gloves, and prepared for a hissing, clawing fight. But surprisingly, the cat didn't struggle at all. It was fully submerged in the water, curled up on the bottom of the container like a rock. I picked it up, shoved it in a cage, dumped out the water, and drove. It wasn't until I was halfway to Wilfell that I noticed the smell. Once, my 9-year-old son dropped a fish stick in the back of my car and forgot about it. A humid summer week later, my car smelled just like that cat had. When we got there, the chubby cat put up about as much of a fight as it had in the van. I didn't hold it for long. Years of experience with scared animals taught me that the less time spent with claws inches from my face, the better. But the short span of time the cat was in my hands was enough to make me seriously uncomfortable. It was heavy and somehow doughy. My hands sunk into its flesh like a silly putty, and it was cold. I left the cat in the quarantine cage in Kathy's office. We usually only use the cage for animals that were obviously ill, which the tabby was not. But there was just something wrong with this cat, like it shouldn't be mixed with others of its species. I gave it bowls of kibble and water, then sat down at the desk to fill out an application for a grant. Kathy was gone for the weekend visiting her sister in Bakersfield. Jacques was in the back cleaning out the pony stall. I couldn't concentrate, not with that cat there. I looked over my shoulder every other minute. Each time I'd see the same thing, the flat-faced tabby, sitting in its water bowl, staring at me. It never blinked. It never moved. It didn't even appear to breathe. The rotting, fishy odor filled the room. Finally, I cracked. I double-checked the latch on the cat's cage, locked the office door, and pretended to be busy feeding the dogs. I called the vet and asked if he could come by and take a look at the feline, but he said he wouldn't be able to for another week. The next morning, I found the office window wide open, the quarantine cage open, and the cat gone. I wasn't disappointed. Not long after that, everyone started talking about little Charlie Henderson. Charlie was 12 and had been skateboarding alone shortly before midnight in the parking lot by Lake Colette. The lake was still scum-covered and fenced off, and the occupants of the nearest homes had long since packed it in for the night. The way he told it, Charlie had been approached by a cat. He bent over to pet it, and the cat danced away, leading him to a grove of trees behind the lake. He followed the cat. Then, suddenly, he was attacked by a small army of cats. They jumped from the trees and emerged from the shadows, latching onto his clothing and limbs and dragging him towards a hole in the fence. If a lost car hadn't pulled into the parking lot and turned around, causing the cats to scatter and giving him time to run away, well, who knows what they'd have done with him. No one believed him, of course. Everyone assumed he'd been attacked by maybe one feral cat and his imagination had taken over. Because cats don't corner people and jump them. That takes organization and planning, intelligence not possessed by house pets. And his story got weird, too. He claimed one of the cats had stretched itself like a silly putty and grew an opposable thumb. Then Jane came back. It was a cloudy afternoon, and I was taking advantage of the slight cool down to deep clean the dog kennel. Kathy was gone again, in Riverside watching her granddaughter play softball. I was busy scraping dried dog crap off the concrete when Jacques ran out to tell me there was a lady asking for me. I wiped off my hands and went inside to find Jane staring at me from Kathy's living room. Jane had never been obsessive about her appearance, but if I hadn't known her so well, I would have assumed the gaunt, trembling figure in a stained wife-beater was a homeless woman. Her hair was a frizzy, matted mess of gray. Her arms and chest were striped with lacerations of varying degrees of depth, in various stages of healing. And her eyes, which had once seemed to serve as a window to a rational, calculating mind, now allowed a glimpse into bloodshot insanity. "Jane," I said, "are you okay?" She didn't smile. "Do you have any?" she asked. I frowned. "Any what?" "Cats, Matthew," was the curt reply. "It's the cats. I need the cats. They've been wondering." I gave her what I hoped was a kind smile. "Okay, Jane, I can show you the cats. But Kathy said I'm not allowed to have any of them adopted without her around." That was a lie, but I wasn't about to pass Jane custody of a pet rock, let alone a living, breathing creature. She was obviously not in the physical, emotional, or mental state to care for anything. not even herself. I walked her out to the cat kennel. As expected, a small herd of dogs ran towards Jane to sniff her and beg for attention. Then, about 3 feet from her, the dogs stopped. They sniffed the air, whined, and ran off in all directions. Not a single one of them got near her. Jane looked over the cat seriously, then sighed in disappointment. She shook her head, turned around, and paced back to Kathy's house. "You haven't caught any," she said. "What are you talking about?" I asked. She glared, looking through me. She could cut through anyone's bullshit and see their soul. "You know what I mean, Matthew. My cats. Call me if you catch one. There's so many of them now, and they're getting bigger." With that, she walked out the door. She stopped and turned around. "And Matthew, watch the lake." I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I'd been wondering where the weird cats came from. They didn't belong to anyone in Juniper Valley, and it was hard to believe that they'd all migrated from Palmdale. Jane took in homeless cats. Maybe they were hers. I didn't know why they would have left food, water, and shelter to wander for miles along an isolated road and into a neighborhood, but it was at least a possibility. That night, following a tangled motivation I couldn't put into words, I borrowed my father's car and drove to the parking lot by Lake Colette, where Charlie Henderson had been attacked. I pulled right up to the fence, turned off my car, let my eyes adjust to the darkness. I obeyed Jane. I watched the lake. I hadn't sat for 10 minutes before I saw movement. A black shape, creeping out of the shadows and approaching the water's edge. More movement against the clump of trees to my right. Cautiously, quietly, I opened the car door and stepped out. I shut the door gently and tiptoed towards the fence. A large black cat waded in the dirty lake. Its paws were inundated. It kept on going. I came closer until I was grasping the metal links of the fence, and I felt it quiver under my fingers. I looked to my right and saw them. 2 more cats. Huge cats. The biggest I'd ever seen. Cats climbing down the fence like monkeys. Head first, completely vertical. One, then the other, jumped gracefully to the ground and stepped into the feeble light bleeding from the 2 streetlights. One was yellow, the other a tabby. The first cat was almost completely submerged. With the lightest gurgle, it ducked under the scum-covered waterline into the black hole. The light wasn't good at all. It looked as though the second and third cats had flattened when they hit the ground, like Play-Doh thrown at a wall. And there was something about how they moved. They jiggled. Their legs bent the wrong way. Or maybe it was just the shitty lighting. Where was the black cat? It couldn't still be underwater. Ripples in the lake. Small islands of yellow scum shifted in gentle waves. I didn't feel a breeze. There was something else in there. A cadence of nerves was triggered in my brain, forgotten but immediately recognizable like a song. I was scared of Lake Colette, scared like I had been as a child, when the black water had seemed from my bedroom window a bottomless well. I ran to my car. I did a donut in the parking lot and sped home. The next morning was hot and bright, and under the cloudless sky, it all seemed ridiculous. I was letting the Charlie Henderson rumors get to me. I walked past Lake Colette on my way to Willfell. I went right up to the fence. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, no cats in sight. A light breeze ruffled the water. I breathed in and gagged. It smelled like rotting fish mixed with a McDonald's dumpster. It smelled like the pug-faced tabby I'd caught. Cats don't like water. Cats don't swim. I'd spent nearly half a decade surrounded by cats, and the cats I'd been chasing around yards and spying on the night before weren't cats. That smell, the way the tabby I'd caught had felt when I held it, bloated and putty-like, cold, Those cats didn't purr or meow. They didn't eat. Their intelligence and that stare, those glassy, corpse-like eyes that seemed to take in everything and nothing. And Jane, her cats, she'd said, they've been wandering. They're getting bigger. Maybe she was going nuts living out there all alone in the wilds, a mile away from her nearest human neighbor. The dogs wouldn't come near her. Her own cats had been attacking her, apparently. How else to explain the scratches all over? Yet, still, she was desperate to have them back. I had to talk to Jane again. Kathy was still gone and it was Jacques' day off, so I planned on heading to Jane's lonely dirt road as soon as I fed the animals. But a couple from Palmdale called unexpectedly, asking if they could come by with their daughter to pick out a pet. By the time they'd selected a corgi mix and made arrangements to have the dog neutered, it was after 5. It was fine, it was still light out. I locked up, grabbed the keys to the van, and made my way into the hills. My teenage bravado waned as I traveled farther and farther away from Juniper Valley. There's no defined town line, but when you reach the intersection of Skylark and Oak Tree Lane, you're essentially watching civilization shrink in your rearview mirror. I'd forgotten just how far away Jane's shack was from anything, and just how desolate and lonely the mountain road became. I didn't see a single other car the whole time. Finally, I came to the rusted blue mailbox with Jane's numbers on the side. I turned on the dirt road. When I reached the apex, I saw Jane's shack. Carefully, foot on the brake, I made my way down into the valley. It didn't look like Jane was home. There was no light coming from the windows. I pulled up closer into the driveway, past the house, to the carport in the back. The back door was wide open, and Jane's El Camino was there. The cats weren't. No cats lounging in piles by the stairs. None prowling around the yard. I pulled behind Jane's car, climbed out of the van, strolled into the backyard. Jane's empty property looked lovely in approaching dusk. Beautiful trees reaching for the heavens, majestic firs meeting fluffy white clouds like an Old West movie backdrop. She must have been hiding in the house. She must have crept up behind me, because I don't remember feeling the blow. I woke up lying in cool, moist dirt. I was looking at water. Lake Colette? No, I saw nothing but hills and foliage in the distance. Where the hell was I? I sat up. My head spun. I felt blood in my hair. I was sitting on the bank of a small pond. The water was greenish and thick with algae, covered in thick yellow scum. I took a breath and lurched. The smell. Rotting fish. Rotting flesh. Fast food dumpster. Stronger than I'd ever smelled it before. The water moved. Something was emerging a few feet in front of me, swimming to shore. A black cat, paddling with uncomfortable, almost human strokes. I scrambled backwards away from the approaching creature. It reached land and pulled itself onto the bank. It stood up. The black cat's weight shifted. Its belly bulged, its lower legs swelled, became shorter and fatter. The effect was the same as squeezing a stress ball. Instead of a creature with a skeleton and tendons and muscles, I was being approached by a thing with the consistency of jelly wearing a furry suit. I screamed and stumbled to my feet. Then I felt icy fingers curl around my neck. I struggled and instinctively horse-kicked my unseen attacker. The hand loosened and I whirled around. I was face to face with Jane. But it wasn't Jane. Her face was round and flat, boneless. The wrinkles under her eyes had smoothed themselves out, and her nose bulged like a mushroom. And her eyes, the maniacal glint was gone from her eyes. So was the consciousness. So was the recognition. So was the vitality. Her pupils were so dilated her irises were no longer visible. and what had been white was now completely red. Her eyes didn't move. They were those of a corpse. Then something in the water grabbed my hand. Something cold and soft and rubber-like, slimy but very, very strong. It pulled me. It was pulling me into the water. Jane stood over me, smiling. She bent down, hands outstretched, pudgy, bloated hands attached to rope-like arms that jiggled and curled and changed shape. What happened next is a blur. I remember clawing, kicking, and screaming at the top of my lungs. And then I was running, stumbling, lungs burning, stinging, aching, cursing the spongy, weeded ground that gave under my feet. I pushed through dry shrubs and jumped over tree branches, praying I was going in a direction that would lead me to humanity, and that the crinkling of grass behind me was only my imagination. Then I was on top of the hill, looking down at Jane's shack. And then I was in Jane's yard. I saw the van and jumped in the driver's seat, silently thanking the guardian angel that distracted me so I'd left my keys in the ignition. I slammed the door. I looked up, out the windshield, and into the red and black, empty eyes of the thing that had been Jane. It was smiling. She always reserved a special smile for me. I turned the key and gunned it. The van jerked violently. I slammed on the brakes, kicking up dirt like smoke. I felt a sticky moisture against my cheeks. I took a breath and barely managed to pull open the door before I projectile vomited. Even thinking about that acidic, rotting seafood stench induces a nauseous tickle in the back of my throat. I'd crushed Jane under the front right tire. She'd popped. The van still ran. I drove it straight to the police station. In the parking lot, I surveyed the damage. The front bumper was dented and a headlight was out. There was no blood. The mangled metal was splattered with glossy, opaque white goo. I was almost completely honest with the sleepy-eyed desk cop. I said that Jane tried to drown me in the hills behind her home, chased me to the van, and then I ran her over. But I left out the part where her body had taken on the properties of pasta and silly putty. The cop asked sarcastically if I'd been doing any drugs, but radioed a car to the site. Over the next week, I was questioned multiple times by the police. Their questions became increasingly bizarre, to the point where they were asking about toxic chemicals and lights in the sky. Seriously. And whether I was or had ever been involved with a heavy metal band or a cult. This was the late 90s. I was chastised for driving down a lonely back road alone to approach a crazy woman, but I was never charged with a crime. The cops were cagey, but they'd found something. By the next morning, Oak Tree Lane was blocked off by the county sheriffs, and the inhabitants of the hills had been roughly evacuated with no explanation. Then came more sheriffs, then the unmarked cars, then the tall, black, barbed wire fence around Lake Colette. Jane's death was reported as a freak accident. I tried to forget. I holed up in my room watching happy movies on VHS until my mom came to take me back home. I went back to school. I threw myself into studying and applying for college. When I needed to, I snuck my mom's sleeping pills. Eventually, however, curiosity overwhelmed my fear. I wanted answers, so I elected to spend the following summer, my last before college, in Juniper Valley with my father. Will Fell was no more. Kathy had left the animals with a larger no-kill shelter in Acton, retired and moved to Riverside. There was a large for sale sign in front of what had once been her home, and it had been a dry winter. The chain-link fence, broken and bent, still surrounded Lake Colette, but the lake was little more than a puddle. I got a job waiting tables at a bar restaurant. I spent my nights serving burgers to bored townies, trying to strike up conversations about the strange events of the previous summer. The shadowy agents, the fence, the crazy cat lady. I was offered nothing but rumors, speculation, and good old-fashioned lies. Finally, I met a man named Aaron. He was in his 20s, chubby and socially awkward. He worked as a counselor at a camp for disabled children. He talked about Dungeons and Dragons a little bit too much, and his uncle was a local cop. It was a slow night. I shot the shit with Aaron for a while. When I asked him if he'd heard about the crazy cat lady who died last year, he played it off like a tabloid headline. But I'd noticed his eyes widen and his hands tremble. I guess I got lucky. Aaron's cop uncle apparently had a weakness for Jack Daniels and a tendency to ignore police confidentiality when drunk. And that weakness must have been genetic, because an hour later, Aaron was singing like a canary. The night Jane had tried to kill me, 2 cops had been dispatched to her home off Oak Tree Lane, expecting to find an empty bottle of Everclear and a discarded bag of shrooms. Instead, they found what had been Jane. Pieces of her were scattered across the ground like debris. They radioed for backup, and a small posse spent the remainder of the night on a scavenger hunt for vital organs. They found skin. Plenty of skin. The piece that once covered her back was folded in a torn white tank top. Her bones and organs seemed strangely melted, as though pulled from a vat of acid, or digested. It was like, one officer had said, Jane had been skinned from the inside, then filled with acidic goo like a water balloon. Everything was coated in a white, translucent jelly substance. The officers had taken a sample to be tested, but by the next morning it had evaporated into a powdery white stain. The big guns were called in. Sheriffs, agents from multiple government divisions, he couldn't say who exactly. The local cops had been pushed out of the investigation by that point. He had heard that upon searching Jane's property, they found an axe, multiple firearms, boxes of ammo, and 10 cat skins buried 1.5 feet deep in the backyard, mostly with their heads detached, and all coated in the familiar white powder. They scoured the hills behind Jane's property, and they found the pond. The small pond that, according to land surveying reports, had not existed before the earthquake and the rains of the previous winter. They drained it. At the bottom, they found 24 more cat skins. The insides were all gone, yet the skins were unmarred. At no point had they been cut apart or sewn together. Again, it appeared as if something had eaten or dissolved all the blood, bones, and vital organs, except for the teeth and the eyeballs. The eyeballs were left intact to stare hauntingly into oblivion. After the discovery, they dragged Lake Colette as well. Aaron didn't know what they'd found there. The citizens of Juniper Valley were urged to stay away. It's been nearly 20 years. I'm a veterinarian now. I've done some digging, spent hours and quarters on the internet where I've seen things I can't unsee and made some new friends. But I still don't have answers. I don't know what changed Jane's cats that summer. Were they infected? Possessed? I think it was something in the water. Hyper-intelligent, blob-like things that had been dormant for years, brought to the surface by that earthquake. But this is all conjecture, my opinion. All those years ago, I told Aaron, the chubby camp counselor, everything. He listened, eyes widening, but never doubting. The next morning, he and I took his car down Oak Tree Lane to the rustling blue mailbox, and finally the abandoned shack where I'd passed so many summer days. We hiked a mile into the hills, carrying 2 shovels and my father's rifle. We found the hole that had once been a pond, now a weeded ditch. We got to work. It was hard work. It was dirty work. It took a few trips, but by the end of August, we had leveled the land and completely filled the hole with dirt. I don't know what was down there, but if there's more, they're not getting out. My name is Eric Williams, and I work as a political reporter in Washington, D.C. I cover Congress, the president, and whatever happens to be the trending topic of the day. I have a couple of sources that I trust and a few that I don't. But as luck would have it, I have found that my most important source of reliable information turns out to be my dog, Applejacks. Let me back up a little. About 3 years ago, I was heading out of my apartment building to do a follow-up on a story when I heard a rustling in the hedges that flank the wide stone steps by the entry. I figured that it must be the raccoon who had been getting into the dumpster, and I gave it no more thought. On my return trip at around 11 p.m., I was halfway up the stairs when I heard a low whine coming from the bushes. So I backed up and peered into the dark undergrowth till I spotted the reflection of two eyes looking back at me. They were a good 3 feet up from the ground, so I started to back up when I heard the unmistakable low thumping of a slowly wagging tail. "Hey there," I said in a calming voice. I moved back and sat down quietly on the bottom step. "You hungry, bud?" Unzipping my backpack, I fished around at the bottom, but all I could find was an energy drink and an old single-serving pack of cereal, Applejacks. I opened it and set it down on the step next to me. It took a few minutes, but then he slowly stepped out of the bushes and made his way cautiously towards the food. He was big, but I could tell he was less than a year old. He was rail thin and looked like he hadn't eaten in a while. Keeping one eye on me, he gingerly sniffed the Applejacks. Then hunger must have overtaken him and he wolfed down the cereal. He flipped the bag over with his nose, checking to make sure he hadn't missed any. Then he looked up at me. I let him sniff my hand and then slowly gave him a scratch behind the ears. Tail wagging, he climbed onto the same step that I was on. Then he sat down, leaning against me. And that was it. We've been together ever since. I looked online, checked the papers and the local bulletin boards for a few weeks to see if anyone was looking for him. After a while, I stopped checking. Soon, we settled into a routine. I took him out in the morning, then he slept for most of the day. In the evening, we went for a long walk in the park. The park we visit is sort of a dividing line between the very rich section of town and the slightly run-down section where my apartment is located. It's a huge park that goes on for miles, with a small river running along the length of it. There is plenty of room for him to chase a ball or run around with other dogs, but it quickly became apparent to me that Jax didn't like the company of other dogs. He wasn't aggressive, he just completely ignored them. They would approach him, tail wagging, wanting to play, but he kept his eyes on me. Along the river there were several old stone bridges, and he loved to run down them, 1,000,000 miles an hour, race across, then turn around and run back to me. This ritual would be repeated at every bridge. I would stand there laughing, urgently calling him back, as if it was a life and death situation. Sometimes he was a little late with the brakes and he would plow into me, landing us both on the ground. Then, one particular Tuesday evening at the park, he crossed the bridge and stopped on the far side. He stood there looking into the woods. He glanced back as if to tell me something. Then he headed straight for the woods. I called, but he kept going. By the time I made it across the bridge, all I could see in the distance was a man kneeling over something on the ground. So I ran. "What happened?" I called out. As I approached, I saw the man had tears in his eyes. There was a golden retriever on the ground in front of him, and Jax was laying with his head on top of the dog's chest. "Did he hurt your dog?" I asked. "No," the man said. "I think he saved him. My dog was having a seizure. They're usually quick to stop if I can calm him down, but this time it wouldn't stop. Not until your dog came and laid down next to him." and seemed to calm him. "Will you be able to get him home?" I asked. "Yes, I'll carry him. We live just over there." He pointed at a large house up on the hill. "Well, I better get him home. Thank you." About a week later, the man with the golden retriever spotted us at the park. He waved and walked over with his dog. It turns out he was looking for us. It turns out his name was Gregory Williams. It turns out he was just elected to the House of Representatives. I am buying Jax a triple cheeseburger on the way home. Maybe two. Since then, Gregory and I met at the park every Tuesday, and we've become good friends. The dogs play together while we talk, and once in a while, he'll give me a heads up on a story. I'm always careful to keep his name out of it. Months went by, and the first Tuesday in December rolled around. We met at the park as usual. While the dogs played, Gregory told me that he was leaving early for Christmas break, taking his family up to a cabin in Colorado. He invited me to come, with Jax, of course. I said that sounded great, but I couldn't take that much vacation time. He told me nothing's happening in DC until after the holidays. Here. He reached for my phone and entered a number. That's the phone to the cabin. Get away as soon as you can. Drive up to Colorado Springs and call me. I'll direct you to the cabin. Make sure you bring Jax and anyone else you like. I mean it. Please come. My wife and kids are dying to meet the hero that saved our dog. And you. I laughed. Okay, I'll try. He looked at me, paused, then said, "If you get there by the 15th of December, I'll give you the story of a lifetime." Then he nodded and walked away. His dog followed behind. I stood there silently watching him go. Back in my apartment, I poured scoops of dog food into Jack's bowl, and I heated up some leftovers for myself. I had an interview tomorrow morning with Senator Susan Collins, the chairman of the Housing and Urban Development Committee, so I sat down on my computer to finalize my questions. I turned on the local news as background noise while I worked. There had been 2 shootings and a robbery nearby. A 10-year-old had gotten lost and then was found safe at a local Walmart, and skywatchers may have a spectacular show in 2 weeks when a comet makes its closest approach on the 16th of December. Jax was sound asleep by the time I finished up and went to bed. I awoke in the morning to a soft beep of a message left on my phone. It was the senator's secretary canceling today's meeting. I called her office to reschedule, but there was only a recorded message saying the senator's office was closed for the holidays. With the morning off, I took Jax for a leisurely walk. Then I caught the train to the Capitol building. I walked over to the congressional offices to see if I could gather some info on an upcoming vote. The guard checked my press ID and nodded. I walked down the quiet hallway to the elevator. Stepping out on the 4th floor, I turned right and stopped. Ahead of me was a long hallway. There must have been 20 small offices. Every door was closed. Lights off. This was very odd, so I got back in the elevator. Stopping at every floor to check, the entire building was completely empty. This just doesn't happen. There are always congressional staff milling about. On my way out the door, I asked the guard what was going on. He just shrugged and said, "No idea." Grabbing a coffee from a nearby street vendor, I sat down at a bench overlooking the main walkway. Taking out my phone, I called my list of political contacts one by one. Either there was no answer, or a message was left saying, "I'm sorry, the office is closed for the holidays." The Congress was slated to work until December 21st. Votes were scheduled for each day. This just doesn't happen. I sat there thinking, vaguely aware of the tourists passing by. A family with 2 kids sat down on the bench next to mine. The kids were asking their dad, "Will we be able to see it?" "Yes," their dad answered. "You might not even need a telescope." Suddenly, I got this vision of thousands of people gathering with binoculars, having comet-themed parties. All the while, silent doom approached. Tossing my coffee into the garage, I headed for the train. I arrived home, took Jax out for a quick walk, and then sat down at my computer. What should I even look for? Impact? No, too many amateur astronomers out there. The news of a catastrophic impact would get out to the public. I spent the next week and a half achieving little to no results. Nothing in the news but excitement over the easily visible approaching comet. I even checked the conspiracy websites, but found nothing out of the ordinary. It was around 11 p.m. when it finally occurred to me that I should stop looking in the present and try looking into the past. I typed in the history of comets. Comets shed a lot of debris, pieces of which can slam into Earth. Comets can cause an air burst, igniting entire forests. They can also produce a high-altitude haze of particles. A comet is linked to the Justinian plague in 541 AD. It was the first recorded instance of the Black Plague in Europe, when cities struggled to clear the streets of the dead. There was the Comet of the Black Death in 1347. During the winter of 1664, a bright comet was seen in the London sky. The Great Plague ravaged England for the next 2 years. I stopped reading, and I realized that if something was coming, Washington was the last place I wanted to be. It was 1:15 midnight, the early morning of December 15th. If I threw my stuff in the car and drove straight through to Colorado Springs, with a little luck, we could make it. I looked over at Jax. "Want to go for a ride?" After uploading a number of horror stories to various places around the internet, I was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of supportive emails and messages I received. It spurred me on to write more, to take my ambition seriously, and to commit an increasing amount of my time to the pursuit of becoming a published author. Little did I know that this newfound acknowledgement of my writing would lead to a series of horrific and abhorrent events. For over a year, I received numerous messages and emails, most very positive and enjoyable. Yet every few days, I would also find a strange, disconnected, and fragmented piece of correspondence sitting in my inbox. Each email would consist of one random word as a subject heading, with the message itself comprised of a single phrase, normally only 2 words long. The email address would change each time, but it was clear from the nature of the content that the author was the same. At first, I dismissed them as the idle product of a bored worker on the internet, attempting to amuse themselves with the thought of myself reading garbled, puzzling, yet worryingly cryptic messages. stood out most uncomfortably from the others. The subject heading was "Suffer," and the email itself contained just 2 words: "Baby cries." I sent the message to my trash folder and thought nothing more of it. It had been a long day, and as I had been writing from dawn to dusk, I was tiring rapidly, feeling suitably ready for a good, long overdue sleep. It was around 11:30 p.m., just as I started to drift into a dream, that I heard a noise. It was not out of place, nor did it cause any real concern to me, coming as it did from my neighbor's house through the wall. It was the type of common sound any resident is familiar with. I smirked to myself, thinking "baby cries," and drifted back to sleep, sure that the child's mother or father would soon be there to comfort it, as they always were. I woke again, glancing at my mobile phone, which cast an unearthly green glow around the room. Seeing that it was after 3 in the morning, I became agitated, knowing that I had a long day ahead of me. Rest does not come easily on those nights when we know we must rise early. The mere thought of the necessity of a good night's sleep before the next day's work precludes any notion of sleep itself. Lying there, I listened in the darkness to the infant next door, breaking its heart, inconsolable and distraught. Surely the parents had not let it scream for all those hours, lying there alone in blackness at night, unattended. After trying to block out the child's cries for what seemed like hours, I admitted defeat and moved to the spare room that my family and friends normally stayed in, on the rare occasions when they visited. At 7:30 a.m., my phone alarm sounded, and after fighting the reality of another day, I reluctantly left my bed, walking slowly to the kitchen to make some coffee. From the window, I looked out onto the street below. What I saw horrified me. A police car and 2 ambulances parked outside of my neighbor's home. Even through my groggy, pre-caffeinated mind, the memory of that helpless child crawling in the night sprung to the fore. Immediately, I stopped what I was doing, threw on some clothes, and ran outside. I was not the only person watching, as the usual nosy residents stood at their doors, with some even out on the street, still wearing their dressing gowns, idly gossiping, whipping up any number of scandalous rumors. Asking several onlookers what had happened, I was told a variety of accounts, from a child being abducted to someone having a seizure during the night. A hush fell over the street as my neighbor's front door finally opened, slowly. 3 police officers exited the house somberly, as a collective gasp seeped out from the mouths of the crowd of onlookers. Quickly behind, 2 men in sterile white clothing carried a stretcher, and on it a body bag containing the now deceased remains of one of my former neighbors. A few cries rang out from across the street. Those who knew them wept, while those who did not gossiped. Then another silence, followed by another stretcher and another body bag. This time no one uttered a sound. The street was void of noise. A tangible tension spread through the air, a hanging sense of dread as all of us waited, hoping beyond hope for no more death. Heartbreak. The last stretcher, supporting a small and insignificant shroud, was carried out solemnly into the morning air and placed carefully into the back of an ambulance. Tears were wept, and answers were demanded from the police, but I could not cope with the sight. I could not bear it. The sound of that poor infant screaming through the night, screaming for its very life, rang out in my ears. The sound of a child, now forever silenced. The memory was deafening. How was I supposed to know? The child had cried before, as many do. I didn't know. I didn't know. I walked, dazed, back through my garden and into the now hollow sanctuary of my house. I'm not ashamed to say that I cried. Cried knowing that maybe if I had just paid attention or shown more concern than simply getting to sleep, that if I had noticed something was amiss, I could have called the police and then perhaps they would still be alive. Several hours later, 2 police officers arrived at my door to ask if I had seen or heard anything unusual from the night before. They said that they were not at liberty to tell me what had happened, but that any information I could give them would help immensely with their investigation. When I told them about the email I had received, they looked at each other with an obvious sense of skepticism. When I showed it to them, they asked if they could have my login details in an attempt to trace where the email came from. Of course, I gave it to them, and then they left after saying that they would be in touch. As soon as they were gone, I returned to the computer screen to switch it off. I recoiled in horror at the sight of another cryptic email sitting in my inbox. The subject heading said, "Fan," and the email again contained only 2 short words. 2 words which drove fear through every part of my being. It simply read, "You told." I was utterly unprepared for the events which followed. Grandpa was 97 years old when he passed away. He lived far from where his 3 children had settled. Grandma died when I was a small child, and he ended up remarrying another woman a few years later, who demanded that he move out west so that she could be nearer to her sons. She was a piece of work, was Grandma Hester. We all wondered how Grandpa could stand her. It turns out that perhaps he couldn't. We're not precisely sure when he developed dementia, but it was probably years before we noticed it. He'd tell us about people he was speaking to or visiting with, or a trip he'd taken. Years later, after we learned he was suffering from dementia, we'd learned that conversation, that trip or visit never actually happened. For all we really knew, any story he told us from the last decade could be a false memory. We would have no way of knowing. Hester rarely communicated with us herself. Probably our first clue that Grandpa wasn't himself anymore happened a few weeks after he came back east to live with my parents. Most of my family had settled in one area. My wife and I lived in the south end of our city, as did one set of cousins. But my father and his 2 sisters all lived in the north, within driving distance of each other. A few of my aunt's children had moved out of town, and my brother had as well, but there were still enough of us for Grandpa to visit with. We would often have gatherings at my parents' house, where Grandpa would either hold court with some story, or just go to sleep. One afternoon, my daughter Brienne, who was in her late teens at the time, came in from playing with my cousin's kids and sat down at the table, where Grandpa had been napping. He suddenly woke and smiled at her. "Well, hello, Claudia," he said brightly. Claudia was my aunt, Dad's youngest sister. "I'm Brienne, Grandpa," said my daughter. "No," said Grandpa, almost sounding offended. "You're my daughter, Claudia." Later that same month, he told my aunts and uncles the story of how he came out east after living with Hester got to be too much. "I prayed to the Lord," said Grandpa, "and the next thing I knew, Martin was here." Martin was my father. I remembered him driving out to the tiny cold house on a hill in Colorado to get Grandpa. He had not come due to any divine intervention. He had come because Grandpa called him in the night and pleaded with him to come get him. We all loved Grandpa, but caring for him was not easy. For one thing, Grandpa had gotten it into his head that he was a young, single man with many years ahead of him, and the only thing missing was a young woman at his side. If he spoke for any length of time with a younger woman, he became convinced that she was in love with him and that perhaps she should be his new bride. He had forgotten her utterly. The women he made advances on included my mother, 2 of my cousins, and my own wife. Thankfully, he couldn't do much more than talk, so it was just a matter of politely changing the subject. But it got worse when he decided he could do things like take walks on his own or try to drive my father's car. Dad and Mom didn't let him go on walks by himself, but that didn't mean he didn't sneak away sometimes when Dad was away and Mom was in the basement. He had to use a walker to get around and simply couldn't do stairs, but refused to admit this to anyone, including himself. This led to a lot of falls. He would also get confused as to where he was or where he lived. At times during his walks, he would attempt to find the old family home that he had raised my father and aunts in, despite it having been long gone since before I was born. Dad picked him up from a police station where he had been taken after some patrol officers saw him wandering around, clearly lost. The time he tried to drive my dad's car was after that. He decided that the reason he had gotten lost is because he had had to walk. He managed to get the emergency brake off and rolled right down the fairly steep incline outside my parents' house, crashing into a fence. The damage was minimal, but after that incident, my parents realized he needed to be in a full-time care facility. It got worse after that. My father visited him 3 times a week. I have no idea how often my aunts went or if they even did. I tended to only go when there was a family gathering, and increasingly I began to realize that he had no clue who I was. He'd smile and greet me as though I was someone he had just met. He'd tell me about his children, describing them as little kids, and even go as far to invent a friend who was looking after them while he was in his home with all these old people. Grandpa was 93 at the time. He was much older than many of the others who lived there. But somehow they were the old people. He was not. When I say things got worse, I mean he changed. The false memories, the refusal to acknowledge that he was elderly, the attempts to chat up ladies and inability to remember that his children were grown, and that he had grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But he had never been violent before. That changed one night. when Dad was called to come to the facility quickly. Grandpa had wandered into the wrong room and had come out screaming, raising his walker up in the air and slamming it into the ground. He even took a few swings at people who tried to calm him down. He began accusing the staff of stealing his things. He was bellowing as loud as he could, "Give them back! Give them back!" I wasn't there for it, and I still have a hard time picturing it. Grandpa barely raised his voice above normal volume during the last decade of his life. When Dad got there, they had gotten him into his room, and he was somewhat appeased. Somewhat. He had a can of Ensure in a tube sock and almost hit my father in the head with it when he came in. He apologized. Dad was one of the few people he always recognized, and said he had been waiting for the thief to come back. "A man who'd steal from me would just as soon kill me," he explained. The Ensure in a sock was his weapon to fend off the thief. Later that night, he told Dad about how much it had scared Florence. He hated that she'd had to go through that. Florence was my grandmother, the one who died when I was 6. He finished by saying that Florence had gone somewhere, and when he went looking for her, they told me she was dead. One day, they're gonna come looking for me, and they're gonna find me dead. That was a jolt to my father. Grandpa had never, at any point before that, acknowledged his mortality, his advanced age, or the fact that he'd probably no more than a handful of years left, at best. Aging and death was something that happened to other people. See, here's a picture of Mom. Why would Charlie let you keep that? He killed your mother, you know, said Grandpa. Murdered her in her sleep. Mother had an aneurysm, said Dad. You and I decided together to unplug the machine. She died in her sleep, but no one killed her. No, it was Charlie. Grandpa's voice was not agitated. It was solid, like he knew for a fact what he was saying. He poisoned her, made something go wrong in her head. I didn't know it then, but I realized it later, after he introduced me to Hester, conned me into marrying her. He's my personal demon, that Charlie. Dad finally had enough. There is no Charlie, he said, nearly shouting. You aren't supposed to correct people who have dementia. It just confuses them more and makes them upset. But my father forgot this in that moment. Charlie is someone you made up. Mom died naturally. You met Hester at a coffee shop years after Mother died, and while she was not a nice woman, she was not unfaithful to you. So please stop talking about Charlie. Dear Lord in heaven, said Grandpa, he got to you. He told you to say those things. You're a part of it too. Grandpa, I said, why don't we start a game of checkers? Usually you love checkers. I don't want to play any fucking checkers, screamed Grandpa. I couldn't have been more surprised if he'd hit me. Grandpa had I only now realized that when Grandpa spoke of this demonic man, I was picturing him in my mind, and I could see him clearly. I thought of the last time I'd visited Grandpa in that tiny house in the mountains of Colorado when I was a teenager, sitting at that little round table while Hester served us some of her inedible glob. And I would see a man standing in the corner of the kitchen, My aunt was a con artist, and she learned from the best, her father. Grandpa never made it big, but he lived for the game. Staying under the radar was probably what made sure he never got caught. Not once. He was so proud of that. Mom didn't take up the family business. She got religion instead and married a tax accountant. It's so ironic that it sounds like a joke, but it's true. Dad was always the best for helping out with math homework. Mom's more colorful relations were kept at a figurative arm's length throughout my childhood, lest they'd corrupt me into following a more interesting life path. Aunt Cassie was the only one who could wiggle her way into my life. She was fully licensed as a psychologist, which made her a smidge more respectable. But Aunt Cassie used her ability to read a person in a whole different way, one probably not intended by the university who issued her degree. Aunt Cassie was a bona fide psychic. She had a shop and everything. Crystals, herbs, candles. Anything you needed to fill the mystic void in your life could be bought for a healthy markup at her little store. There was even a private room in the back that was used for readings and seances. Because both my folks worked, I would often get dropped off at the shop where I would help Aunt Cassie out with those little shows. Anything from messing with the lights to knocking on walls. Playing with the thermostat was my idea, and an effective one. Customers came to get chills down their spine, didn't they? Why not provide? Cassie helped me become the skeptic I am today. Showed me all the behind-the-scenes sleight-of-hand stuff. We'd watch daytime talk shows with magicians and mediums, and Cassie would explain every step, from a basic rundown of cold readings to how to spot an audience plant. After one particularly convincing episode, I asked the natural question, could some of it be real? My aunt's reply was firm. The dead don't talk, kiddo. Anyone who claims otherwise is blowing smoke out their ass. It was her conviction more than anything that made me believe her. There was only one client I ever saw my aunt refuse. He was old, bald, and stooped. He took his hat off when he came inside and twisted it in his hands as he talked. Cassie tensed up immediately when she saw him. The man claimed to have worked in the prison systems, death row. He'd been responsible for carrying out the final punishments of the worst convicted criminals on the planet. In his old age, this tormented him, ate at his soul. He wanted Cassie to contact the souls of the ones he'd killed, so he could apologize and beg forgiveness before he joined them. My aunt threw the most epic fit. I'd never seen her so mad. She hollered and threw things, shouting for him to shut up and get out. I hid under the counter with my hands over my ears until he left. Later, I thought her reaction was one of fear because of the man's job. An executioner has to be a con artist's worst fear. Eventually, I got found out. I wanted to put on a magic show for my folks, and stupidly, I thought I'd do a medium bit, where I pretended to talk to Grandpa for Mom. Huge mistake. Mom freaked the hell out and banned me from seeing her sister ever again. I'd left some textbooks at the shop though, so I got to run in and grab them, while Mom fumed in the car outside. Aunt Cassie didn't even have to ask what was wrong. She could read my face after all. I gave her a hug and a teary, snot-filled goodbye. She did tell me one last secret though. Kiddo. There's a curse in this family that gets passed like a torch. I hope to whatever gods might be out there, that I don't pass it on to you when I go. We didn't get to talk again for more than 9 years. That's when Facebook became popular, and no parental ban could help me from trying to reconnect. It was awkward. She'd had a tough go of life. To pay bills, she went honest. And with her business went all her zest and playful passion for life. One day, I got home to a message waiting in my inbox that made my stomach drop to the floor. I love you, kiddo. Remember what I told you. I dialed her number, already crying. No answer. Didn't stop me from dialing again and again and again and again. I was too much of a mess to tell my mom. The police did that for me, though, the next day. Car accident. Drunk driver. The funeral was a blur. Relatives I'd never seen in the flesh packed the church. I sat between my parents in the front row and racked my brain trying to figure out what it was my aunt wanted me to remember. We followed the hearse to the cemetery in dead silence. The priest did the last little speech, and then I was left alone by her headstone, still straining to remember what she had told me. Little bits of my parents' conversation floated in and out of my attention span. My mother said something about how it was a shame it was such a small turnout. Small turnout? That bothered me. The service had practically been stuffed to the rafters. I turned around to say something and finally understood. Behind my parents, there was a whole host of people, all standing and staring dead ahead. My parents weren't paying them the slightest attention. The priest muttered some soothing condolences and excused himself, walking right through the thick of the crowd without disturbing a single soul. At the head of the group, looking just like the day I'd seen her last, was Cassie. All the rest in peace sentiment in the world wouldn't have done her any good. Her mouth was wide, wide open. Like that, I knew. I know what the family curse is. I know why the dead don't talk. They're too busy screaming. Ever wondered if things can just be born evil? In this enlightened age of ours, concepts like good and evil are often painted as outmoded, archaic even. According to modern thought, people, animals too, obviously, are simple products of their environment and no more responsible for their actions than a twig in a stream. But I know better. Some things are just born bad. About 10 years ago, we had a German Shepherd named Duchess that had a litter of puppies, 7 in all. 6 looked like any other shepherd you've ever seen. The 7th was a snowy white. Not a true albino, just white-furred with a black nose and blue eyes. There was never any doubt about which one we were keeping out of that litter. We named her Princess. Before the end of 6 months, any plans we had about giving away or selling the others became a moot point, as all of the others were dead. We'd just find them at a rate of about 1 a month, not mangled or anything, just dead as if they died in their sleep. At first, we thought maybe their mother, it being her first litter and all, was accidentally crushing or smothering them. Later, we had no doubt as to what had killed them. Within a year, she came to dominate her mother, her father, tough old alpha that he was, and to a degree, us too. Her parents shied away from her. When we put out their food, she ate to her heart's content, unchallenged by the other two. Once I tried to shoo her away and let the other two eat. She snarled at me, baring those perfect white fangs to her black gums, and loosing a growl so deep that I felt it in my guts more than heard it. After that, I left her alone too. I've often wondered if the parents of serial killers know that they have a monster in the making. I mean, sure, some of them are to blame for how their kids turn out. Products of messed up households with systematic abuse of all possible flavors. But then there are the ones that seem to be true aberrations. It's those families I'm curious about. Do they smile and laugh and pretend that everything's fine? I know that we sure did. We downplayed the weirdness around Princess, tried to rationalize her behavior, the bizarre things she'd do, like killing rabbits and leaving them hung up in the bushes behind our home. Some dogs do that to show they love you. Cats too, my father would say. To them, it's just bringing you food. To me, it's like she was taunting us. Just like the puppies years earlier, not one of those rabbits ever had a mark on them. Princess, just like her mom and dad, was well looked after and never hurt for a meal, so it wasn't as if she was hunting for food. Her innumerable kills were always untouched. No, the only thing I ever saw her eat was a kitten. We had some feral cats in the woods around our house, and one mama cat had a litter in our tool shed. I returned home from school one day and headed around back to look in on them. The door to the shed was open, and inside I found Princess, her jaws pink from her feast. As she devoured that last kitten, her beautiful blue eyes never left mine. The mama we found displayed on what I'd come to think of as the rabbit bush. The tipping point came that same year when we found her sire dead. He was the best dog we'd ever had, that we ever will have. We woke one Saturday morning to find him in the backyard lying dead without a mark, like so many rabbits before him. I can count the number of times I ever saw my father cry on one hand. That was one of them. That was also when we found out how she killed so cleanly. She strangled her prey, like a jaguar. The fur at her father's neck was still wet with her saliva. We spent that morning burying that good old faithful dog, and then he sent me and my mom away on some pretense. No words were spoken, but there was no doubt about what he intended to do. I'm sure that there are some of you reading this that will find the notion of putting an animal down to be abominable. But what other options did he have, really? Take her to an animal shelter? Give her to some other family? Who could do weren't getting any sleep that night, regardless of our decision. We spent that afternoon at my uncle's house. Once, when I came in from playing to get a glass of water, I overheard my mom telling my uncle that she sometimes wondered if the dog was possessed or something. I'd sometimes wondered the same thing. Later that evening, not long before sunset,
This time we start our list with a recording from Japan. This video is so fascinating because it was captured by a television crew recording reports from the police station. At first glance, an ordinary recording of a report,